Only 6 people in the world knew what really happened that night. Not the cameras, not the press, not the martial arts federations with their trophies and their rule books and their carefully curated histories. 6 people. And for over a decade, every single one of them stayed silent. Not out of shame, not out of fear, out of something rarer than either of those things. Reverence. Because what they witnessed inside that private dojo in Los Angeles sometime in the late summer of 1972 was not a sparring session. It was not a demonstration. It was not a friendly exchange between 2 men who happened to be the greatest fighters of their generation. It was a reckoning. A collision between 2 completely different philosophies of combat, one built on discipline, tradition, and raw physical dominance, and the other built on something that most people in that room had never seen before and would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe. The footage was never released. The names were never printed. But the story survived. And this is how it happened. You have to understand who Chuck Norris was in 1972. Not the cultural icon, not the meme, not the action star with the beard and the quip. The real Chuck Norris. The one who had just come home from the United States Air Force. The one who had trained Tang Soo Do obsessively, relentlessly, with the kind of single-minded devotion that most people reserve for religion. The one who had won the professional middleweight karate world championship, not once, not twice, but 6 consecutive times. 6. In a sport where one championship separates you from the rest of the world, Chuck Norris had built a wall between himself and every other fighter on the planet, then climbed to the top of it and stood there without blinking. He was 6 feet tall, 180 pounds of compressed muscle trained over years of brutal discipline. His kicks were the stuff of legend in the martial arts community, precise, devastating, launched from angles that human bodies weren't supposed to reach. Men who sparred with him described it the same way over and over. You saw it coming and still couldn't stop it, like trying to catch lightning with your bare hands. By 1972, Chuck Norris was not just a fighter, he was a force of nature with a name. And Bruce Lee? Bruce Lee was something else entirely. He was 31 years old that year, 5 feet 7 inches tall, 135 pounds soaking wet. In a sport obsessed with weight classes and physical measurements, Bruce Lee looked like he didn't belong in the same conversation as men like Norris. That was, of course, exactly what made him dangerous. The 2 of them had met years earlier, circling each other the way 2 storm systems circle before they collide. They'd trained together informally, exchanged techniques, philosophies, ideas. There was genuine respect between them, a mutual recognition of greatness that only the truly exceptional can offer each other. But respect and surrender are different things. And in the summer of 1972, something shifted. It didn't start with words. It rarely did with men like these. It started with a rumor, the kind of rumor that moves through the martial arts world like smoke through a keyhole, quiet, invisible, impossible to trace back to its source. The rumor said that Chuck Norris had made a comment at a private training session, something about Bruce Lee's philosophy, something about the difference between real fighting and movie fighting. The exact words were never confirmed, but the sentiment was clear enough. There were men in the martial arts world, serious men with calluses on their knuckles and decades of sweat in their gi, who quietly believed that Bruce Lee's Jeet Kune Do was brilliant as philosophy, but untested as combat, that his movies were spectacle, that his demonstrations were controlled environments, that the real question, the question nobody said out loud, was how that 135-pound body would hold up against a world champion who was 45 pounds heavier and 2 inches taller. Chuck Norris was too disciplined, too professional, too deeply respectful of Bruce Lee to ever say something like that publicly. But privately, in a room full of fighters who all spoke the same unspoken language, the question had been asked. Bruce Lee found out, not through a phone call, not through a letter, through the same invisible network that had carried the original rumor, a look here, a word there, the slow accumulation of information that travels between men who spend their lives studying each other. He didn't get angry. He didn't call Chuck Norris out. He didn't make a scene. He didn't do any of the things that a lesser man with a bigger ego might have done. He made a phone call, 2 sentences, maybe 3, and 3 days later, on a Thursday evening in late August, 6 men gathered in a private dojo in the San Fernando Valley. No press, no cameras, no audience, just the 6 of them, and a wooden floor, and the peculiar quality of silence that fills a room when everyone in it knows that something important is about to happen. The dojo belonged to a man named Richard.
He was a former student of Chuck Norris, a man who trained under him for 4 years and carried that experience the way veterans carry medals, quietly but always present. He'd opened the space 2 years earlier, a converted garage with mirrors along one wall and a heavy bag in the corner that had absorbed several thousand punches and was starting to show it. The other 4 men in the room were fighters, all of them serious, all of them connected in various ways to either Bruce Lee or Chuck Norris or both. Their names are not part of this story, at their own request passed down through the people they eventually told, but their presence mattered because of what they represented. Witnesses. Real ones. Men who could look at what was about to happen and understand it, who wouldn't mistake speed for luck or technique for trick, who would carry what they saw with the accuracy of people trained to see. Chuck Norris arrived first. He wore a plain gray t-shirt and dark training pants, no ceremony. He walked in the way that champions walk, not with arrogance, but with the particular stillness of someone who has been in enough high-stakes moments that the stillness has become automatic. He nodded at the 4 men. He looked at the floor. He waited. Bruce Lee arrived 7 minutes later. He walked through the door and the room changed. It's difficult to describe this to someone who never saw it in person, who only knows Bruce Lee from his films. The movies captured his speed and his precision, but they couldn't capture the thing that people who met him actually described, this quality of concentrated presence, like every atom of the man was fully, completely awake, like he took up more space than his body should have allowed. He was wearing a black t-shirt. His forearms, even at rest, looked like they'd been carved from hardwood. He looked at Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris looked at him. No words. Not yet. They talked for almost 45 minutes before anything physical happened. This is the part that surprises people when they hear the story. They expect 2 legends to walk into a room and immediately start throwing hands. But that's not how men like this operate. That's not how the truly dangerous ones think. They sat across from each other on the floor, the way students sit, and they talked about fighting, about philosophy, about what combat actually is when you strip away the rules and the trophies and the television lights. Chuck Norris believed in the system. He built his life on it. Tang Soo Do had a lineage, a structure, a set of principles that had been refined over centuries. Every technique he threw had been practiced 10,000 times before it was used once in competition. There was a reason for the forms. There was a reason for the hierarchy. The system wasn't a cage, it was a foundation. You needed the foundation before you could build anything worth standing on. Bruce Lee listened. Then he said something that made the room go very quiet. He said, and this is as close to a verbatim account as exists, passed through 2 of the witnesses before it was eventually written down, that a system is a collection of someone else's answers to someone else's problems, that real combat is not a problem anyone has solved before, that the moment you enter a real fight, everything you've memorized becomes a liability, because the fight doesn't care about your training, it only cares what you do right now, in this second, with this opponent, in this exact configuration of bodies in space and time. Chuck Norris was silent for a moment. Then he said, prove it. Not aggressively, not as a taunt, as a genuine question, the kind of question that only real fighters can ask each other, stripped of everything except the pure desire to know. One of the witnesses later said it was the most honest thing he'd ever heard a man say. Bruce Lee stood up.
They didn't bow. That's one of the details that stuck with the witnesses. 2 men steeped in martial arts tradition, and no bow. No ceremonial acknowledgement of what was about to happen. Because this wasn't ceremony. This was the real thing. They squared off in the center of the dojo. The 4 witnesses moved to the walls. Richard killed 2 of the overhead lights, leaving the room in a dimmer, more focused glow. Not for drama, but because the glare had been bouncing off the mirrors and creating blind spots. Chuck Norris was in his fighting stance immediately. 45-degree angle, weight balanced, hands up but relaxed. 6 world championships and thousands of hours of sparring had made this stance as natural as breathing. There was no thought in it, no visible effort. His eyes were calm, focused, tracking. Bruce Lee was doing something different. He was moving. Not attacking, not circling in the conventional sense. Something more fluid than that. A kind of constant low-level motion that made him hard to fix on visually. It was subtle enough that a non-fighter might not have noticed it, but Chuck Norris noticed. One of the witnesses saw his eyes change when he clocked it, a small adjustment in his attention. Because that motion wasn't restlessness, it was information gathering. Bruce Lee was reading him. Every tiny shift, every micro-expression of weight and balance, every millimeter of movement that Chuck Norris made, Bruce Lee was collecting it all, storing it, building a real-time map of his opponent's body and its tendencies. This is one of the things that made Bruce Lee terrifying to fight, according to people who had done it. He didn't just see you, he understood you, faster than should have been possible, faster than your own nervous system could process. And then he struck. It happened in the space between one breath and the next. Bruce Lee closed the distance, not by stepping, but by what felt to the witnesses like a skip, a compression of space, and threw a straight right that stopped 2 inches from Chuck Norris's jaw. Controlled, precise,
a demonstration, not an attack. Chuck Norris didn't flinch. He checked the punch with his left forearm, smooth and practiced, a motion so ingrained it was essentially involuntary. Then he countered, a tight right cross that was fast, genuinely fast, the kind of speed that had ended professional karate careers. And Bruce Lee wasn't there. Not blocked, not deflected. Gone. He'd moved laterally, just enough, just in time, in a way that one witness later described as like water moving around a rock. Not because it was slow or gentle, but because it was so perfectly efficient that it looked effortless. Chuck Norris reset. His jaw was tight. The room was completely silent. And then the real sparring began. What followed, and what the witnesses would spend years trying to describe accurately, was not what most people imagine when they think of a fight. There was no flurry of wild strikes, no dramatic exchanges of heavy blows. It was something more precise than that, and more intense. A conversation, in the language of bodies. Chuck Norris threw a sidekick, his signature, his devastating weapon, the kick that had dismantled world-class fighters on 4 continents. It was textbook, perfectly executed, launched from his hip with the full rotational force of his core behind it, aimed at Bruce Lee's midsection with the precision of a man who'd thrown that exact kick approximately 100,000 times. Bruce Lee absorbed it on his lead arm, redirected the momentum with a small, almost invisible body rotation, and in the same motion, the same single motion, not 2 moves but 1, slipped his right hand past Chuck Norris's extended leg and stopped his knuckles against his ribs. One witness said, "He didn't block it. He used it." Chuck Norris stepped back. For the first time that evening, something crossed his face that wasn't calm. The 4 witnesses later agreed that this was the moment the session changed. Up until that exchange, there had been a quality of mutual exploration to what they were doing. 2 masters taking each other's measure. A calibration. But when Chuck Norris felt that strike land against his ribs, light, controlled, but undeniably there, something shifted in him. Not anger. Chuck Norris was too disciplined for anger. Urgency. He came forward with a combination. Jab, cross, roundhouse. Sharp and committed. The kind of sequence that in a tournament setting would have scored immediately. Fast. Powerful. Each strike carrying real intent. Bruce Lee was already moving. He slipped the jab by 2 inches. He rode the cross with his shoulder, letting it graze past him rather than fighting its force. And the roundhouse. The kick that had Chuck Norris's full weight and rotation behind it. The kick that professional fighters had lost matches trying to block. Bruce Lee stepped inside it. Inside it. He got close enough that the kick passed behind him, its force spent on empty air. And in that same moment, he was at chest-to-chest range with Chuck Norris, which is exactly the range where our kicks become useless, where reach advantages disappear, where the fight becomes something intimate and terrifying. Chuck Norris felt the proximity. He felt it before he processed it intellectually. And in that half-second of recalibration, Bruce Lee placed his palm flat against Chuck Norris's chest. Not a strike, not a push, a touch, and said quietly, "You see it now." The room held its breath. Chuck Norris looked down at the hand on his chest. Then he looked up, and something happened on his face that the witnesses, years later, would struggle to name. Not defeat, not humiliation, something more complex. Something that looked from across the room like the very specific emotion of a man who has just encountered something he didn't know existed. Recognition. The recognition that he was standing in the presence of a completely different order of fighter.
The 6 men stood in that dim dojo for another hour. Not sparring, not demonstrating, just talking, the way fighters talk after something real has happened, in that particular register of conversation that only exists after the adrenaline has metabolized, and what's left is the pure distillate of what was learned. Chuck Norris asked questions. Bruce Lee answered them, sometimes with words, sometimes by moving his hands, sometimes with a silence that was itself a kind of answer. At one point, Chuck Norris said something that one of the witnesses always remembered because of how simple it was. He said, "I've been training since I was 18 years old. I've never felt like a beginner before tonight." And Bruce Lee, without any trace of triumph or condescension, said, "That's the most important thing you've felt in years." They shook hands at the end. Proper handshake. 2 hands, eyes level. The kind of handshake that means something in the world of fighters. Then they left. The witnesses dispersed into the Los Angeles night. Richard locked the dojo. The heavy bag hung still in the corner. The mirrors reflected an empty room. And for years, for over a decade, nothing was said publicly. No article, no interview, no mention in the martial arts press. The 6 men who'd been in that room had seen something they didn't have a framework to explain to people who hadn't been there, so they simply didn't explain it. They carried it. The way you carry something valuable and irreplaceable, carefully, privately, without display. The story moved anyway, the way true stories always move, through whispers, through the specific frequency of information that travels between people who are serious about the same thing. Someone told someone who told someone, and slowly, over years, the outline of what had happened that evening began to exist in the wider world, fragmented, disputed, often distorted, but persistent. Because truth is persistent, even when nobody's trying to spread it. Years later, long after Bruce Lee was gone, long after the grief of that loss had settled into the permanent ache that the people who knew him carried, Chuck Norris spoke about Bruce Lee publicly. Not about that evening specifically, never that evening specifically, but about Bruce Lee. He called him the most extraordinary martial artist he had ever encountered. Not one of, not qualified, the most. He said that Bruce Lee made him question everything he thought he knew about fighting, that he went back to his own training differently after knowing him, that there was a before Bruce Lee and an after Bruce Lee in the way he understood combat. He said in one interview that became famous in martial arts circles that Bruce Lee moved like he was from the future. People took that as a poetic compliment. The 6 people who'd been in that dojo knew it was a technical description. Here is what Bruce Lee was actually doing that night. He'd spent years not just training, but thinking, dissecting, questioning every assumption that the martial arts world had accumulated over centuries of tradition. Taking apart the systems, examining the components, asking which pieces were genuine discoveries about how human bodies fight, and which pieces were institutional habit masquerading as wisdom. He'd concluded that most fighting systems were built backward. They started with forms, fixed patterns of movement, and tried to apply those patterns to the infinite variability of real combat, which meant that every fighter trained in a traditional system was essentially trying to match the chaos of an actual fight to a pre-existing template. When the match worked, the template got the credit. When it didn't, the fighter got the blame. Bruce Lee flipped it. He started with the fight itself, with the actual reality of 2 human bodies in space and what physics and anatomy and perception meant for how they could move and strike and defend. He built upward from first principles, not downward from tradition. The result was Jeet Kune Do, which isn't, despite how it's sometimes described, a style. It's the explicit rejection of style. It's the insistence that the only valid technique is the one that works, right now, against this specific opponent in this specific moment. That the moment you commit to a style, you've told the fight what you're going to do before the fight starts. That night in the dojo, Chuck Norris had walked in with 6 world championships and the most refined karate system on the planet. And Bruce Lee had walked in with no system at all. Just presence, just perception, just the absolute ruthless commitment to being fully awake to what was actually happening. And that quality of radical aliveness had been the difference. Not speed alone, though he was blisteringly fast. Not strength alone, though pound for pound his physical power was genuinely remarkable. But the combination of physical capability with this quality of attention that meant he was never fighting a memory of the fight. He was always only fighting the fight. Bruce Lee died on July 20, 1973. He was 32 years old. The cause was a cerebral edema, a swelling of the brain triggered by an allergic reaction to a painkiller. Fast, without warning, in the city of Hong Kong, in the apartment of an actress, with no one beside him who understood what was happening until it was already too late. He left behind 4 films, a philosophy, a body of writing and personal notes that filled journals and notebooks with ideas so dense and precise that researchers are still unpacking them, and a generation of fighters who would spend their entire careers chasing the thing he'd embodied, that quality of aliveness, that absolute presence in combat, without ever quite reaching it. He also left behind 6 men who'd stood in a dim dojo in the San Fernando Valley and watched 2 of the greatest fighters who ever lived occupy the same room at the same time. And one of those 6 men, one of the witnesses, now very old, interviewed once and never again, was asked what he remembered most from that night. He thought about it for a long time. Then he said,
the sound of Chuck Norris exhaling. The interviewer asked what he meant. "When you've been in the martial arts long enough," the man said, "you learn to read breath. You can tell a lot about a fighter from how they breathe, how much effort something cost them, whether they're scared or tired or surprised." He paused. Chuck Norris made a sound when that hand touched his chest. Just a breath. But it was the sound of a man encountering something he couldn't explain. And I'd heard him spar with world champions and never heard him make that sound before. He shook his head. Bruce Lee made the best fighter of his generation sound like that. Another long pause. That's what I remember. They called him too small, too light, too philosophical, too obsessed with ideas and not enough with competition. They said his fighting was for films, not for real. They were wrong. Not because he would have beaten every fighter who ever lived. That's not the kind of claim that can be proven, and that's not the point. The point is something simpler and more profound. Bruce Lee saw something that most people spend their entire lives missing. He saw that the ceiling most fighters hit isn't physical, it's conceptual. It's the ceiling of the system they're inside, a ceiling built not by the limits of their body, but by the limits of their framework, their map of what fighting is. He refused the ceiling. He refused the system. He refused the framework. He refused the comfortable safety of tradition and tournament and institutional validation, and he went all the way back to the beginning, to the raw question of what a human body can do when it stops trying to be a style and starts trying to be alive. And in that dojo, on that Thursday evening in August, he showed one of the greatest fighters in the world what the answer to that question looked like. Chuck Norris walked out of that building a different fighter than the one who'd walked in. Not weaker, better. That's what Bruce Lee left behind. Not just a philosophy printed in books, not just a legacy captured in film. He left behind a question, a living, breathing, permanent question that every fighter who encounters his work has to answer for themselves. Are you fighting the fight you train for? Or are you fighting the fight that's actually happening? Adapt what is useful, reject what is useless, and add what is specifically your own. Bruce Lee.